The darkness between stars was Commander Lysara's home, and she had spent 3 centuries crossing the void in ships that moved faster than light itself. And beside her always were the dragons who answered only to her voice and obeyed only her commands because she had raised them from hatchlings in the ancient way of her people. The Valkoran were legends across 1,000 worlds, and their silver hair and violet eyes marked them as the apex predators of known space. And when they're black, ships appeared in orbit. Every civilization understood that resistance meant death and surrender meant servitude under masters who showed no mercy to those who defied them. Lysara stood on the command bridge of her flagship watching screens that showed the vast emptiness ahead, while her hand rested on the neck of Ember, who was the smaller of her 2 dragons, and whose scales gleamed red like cooling metal in the low light, and beside them Storm waited with golden eyes that saw things no sensor could detect. Her fleet consisted of 12 warships, each carrying hundreds of warriors and dozens of dragons, and they moved through space in perfect formation that had been practiced over millennia of conquest, and behind her, the War Council had given clear orders about the new species that needed to be brought into the Empire. The humans were young as civilizations measured time, and they had only left their homeworld a few centuries ago, but they had spread across dozens of systems, with surprising speed, and built colonies on worlds that other species considered too harsh or too remote to bother. Claiming intelligence reports said humans were weak compared to Valkoran warriors, and their technology was primitive, and their ships were slow and clumsy, and their lifespans were so brief that they barely had time to learn anything before dying, and replacing themselves with new generations who had to learn everything again. The War Council had laughed when human diplomats came to the Valkoran homeworld and refused to accept imperial authority, and the diplomats said their people valued freedom above all else, and would never bow to any master no matter how powerful, and the council had found this amusing, because every species said similar things before reality taught them otherwise. Lysara remembered watching those diplomats leave and noticing something strange in their eyes, because they showed fear like any sensible creature would when facing the Valkoran. But underneath that fear was something else that looked almost like pity, as though they felt sorry for what was about to happen. She had dismissed the feeling at the time, because she had seen 100 species make brave speeches before accepting the inevitable, and humans would be no different once they understood what the Valkoran really were, and what happened to those who stood against the Empire. The target system appeared on her screens, and it was designated Haven 7 by the simple human naming system, and the colony there held 2 million humans who worked in mines and farms and factories that supplied other settlements deeper in their territory. Lysara gave the order to drop out of faster-than-light travel, and the universe twisted around her fleet as they emerged into normal space, and alarms immediately started sounding, because the humans had detected them instantly and were already moving to intercept. The human defense fleet consisted of 30 ships, and they looked nothing like proper warships because their hulls were covered in external plating that seemed bolted on as an afterthought, and their weapons were mismatched and their formations were loose and undisciplined. Her tactical officer reported that human vessels were broadcasting on open channels and requesting communication, and Lysara considered ignoring them, but curiosity made her accept the connection because she wanted to hear what these creatures would say when they saw what they faced. The screen flickered and showed a human woman wearing a dark blue uniform with symbols that marked her as a military commander, and her hair was cut short, and her face showed lines that came from stress and responsibility, and her eyes were clear and calm. As she looked directly at Lysara, the human introduced herself as Captain Amy Wilson of the Human Defense Forces, and she said that the Valkoran fleet had entered human territory without permission and needed to leave immediately or face consequences, and her voice was steady and showed no hesitation. Lysara felt genuine surprise because this creature spoke as though she held the advantage when any child could see that 12 Valkoran warships could destroy 30 human vessels without taking significant damage, and the captain should have been begging for mercy, not issuing demands. She responded in the common trade language that most species used and explained that the Valkoran did not ask permission and did not negotiate with prey, and that Haven 7 would submit to imperial authority within one rotation or be pacified by force. Amy Wilson listened without interruption, and then said something that Lysara would remember for the rest of her very long life, because the human captain said that her people had a saying about what happened when you cornered an animal and made it choose between surrender and fighting. And the saying was that cornered animals were the most dangerous ones. The communication ended, and Lysara ordered her fleet to advance in standard attack formation, while her dragons sensed her confidence and prepared for battle, and she watched the human ships scatter in what looked like complete panic as they broke formation and fled in different directions. Her tactical officer reported easy targeting solutions and requested permission to open fire, and Lysara granted it, while thinking that this would be over quickly, and the humans would learn the same lesson every other species had learned, about the price of defiance. The first volley of plasma fire streaked across space toward the nearest human vessels, and the shots were perfect because Valkoran gunners trained for decades before being allowed to man weapon stations, and every bolt should have struck true and disabled the targets. But the human ships moved at the last possible moment, and they accelerated past their safe limits and threw themselves into wild maneuvers that should have torn them apart from the stress, and most of the plasma bolts missed completely, while a few scraped shields and did minimal damage. Lysara leaned forward because something was wrong with this picture, and the humans were not fleeing in panic, but were moving with purpose, and their scattered formation suddenly made sense as they positioned themselves around her fleet in a wide sphere. The human ships opened fire, and their weapons seemed weak because they used primitive kinetic rounds instead of energy weapons, and the projectiles bounced off Valkoran shields like rain hitting stone. And Lysara almost felt disappointed that this was all they could manage. Then her damage control officer reported that 3 ships had lost primary power and were running on emergency systems, and Lysara demanded an explanation because nothing had penetrated their shields, and the officer said the human rounds had been packed with devices that generated electromagnetic pulses when they struck. The humans were not trying to destroy Valkoran ships, but were targeting specific systems to disable them, and they were using cheap, simple weapons that cost almost nothing to produce and could be fired in massive quantities, while the Valkoran relied on expensive plasma cannons that needed time to recharge between shots. Lysara watched her tactical display change from green to yellow as more ships reported systems failures, and she realized that humans had studied Valkoran technology and found weaknesses that no one else had noticed because every other species tried to match them in direct combat instead of fighting smart. She ordered her dragon riders to launch and attack the human ships directly, because no species could stand against Valkoran warriors mounted on beasts that could survive in vacuum and breathe fire that melted metal, and her people had won countless battles this way when their ships were damaged. The dragons emerged from launch bays across the fleet, and their riders wore armor that was bonded to their skin, and carried weapons that had been forged in the hearts of dying stars, and they streaked toward the human vessels like falling meteors trailing fire. Amy Wilson's face appeared on the screen again, and the human captain said, "This was the last chance to stop before people died," and Lysara laughed because humans clearly did not understand what was coming for them. The dragon riders crossed the distance between fleets in seconds, and Lysara watched through the eyes of her warriors as they approached the human ships and prepared to breach hulls and tear through corridors and show these creatures what happened when someone challenged the Valkoran Empire. But the human vessels opened hatches that should have been used for docking, and instead launched objects that looked like simple metal spheres, and the spheres drifted in clusters around each ship, creating fields of obstacles that the dragons had to avoid. One rider ignored the spheres and flew straight through them, and the moment his dragon touched one, there was a bright flash, and electromagnetic energy discharged through the beast and its rider, and both of them went limp and started drifting helplessly in space. Lysara realized the humans had created traps specifically designed to stop dragons, and her riders scattered to avoid the sphere fields while looking for safe approach vectors. But the humans were already moving again, and their ships rotated to keep the barriers between them and the attackers. Her best warrior was named Cathera, and she had fought in 70 campaigns and never been defeated, and she guided her dragon called Nightwing around the sphere field and found an opening near one ship's engine section, and they dove through the gap, moving faster than human weapons could track. Nightwing breathed fire across the hull, and the metal glowed red, but did not breach, because the humans had layered their armor in ways that dispersed heat. and Cathara drew her blade and prepared to cut through manually when the hull suddenly opened from inside. Human soldiers in armored suits emerged, and they carried weapons that fired solid rounds instead of energy beams, and they opened fire at point-blank range, and the rounds could not penetrate Valkoran armor, but the impacts knocked Cathara sideways and forced her dragon to pull back. More humans came out, and they moved in coordinated groups that covered each other and used the ship's hull for protection, and they were not trying to kill the dragons, but were driving them away from vulnerable areas while other soldiers sealed the breach points. Lysara had never seen prey species fight back like this against dragon riders, and the humans showed discipline that came from serious training, and they used tactics that suggested they had studied Valkoran combat methods and developed specific counters. She ordered half her riders to return and defend the fleet, because the human ships were getting too close and their weapons were doing more damage than expected, and 3 of her vessels were already dead in space with crews trying to restore power. The battle became chaos as both sides adapted to each other, and Lysara realized that humans learned incredibly fast, and every tactic that worked once became less effective the second time because they adjusted their responses and found new counters her communications. Officer reported that human ships were singing over their channels, and Lysara ordered the audio played and strange music filled the bridge, and the humans were singing about standing firm and never surrendering and facing death with courage. The words made no tactical sense because songs did not win battles, but Lysara noticed that human coordination improved when they sang, and they moved together like they shared one mind, and their seemingly random actions suddenly showed patterns that were hard to predict but clearly planned. Storm growled beside her, and the great dragon's eyes tracked something on the screens that Lysara had missed, and she looked closer and saw that 3 human ships had positioned themselves perfectly to disable her flagship if they fired at the right moment. She ordered evasive maneuvers, but her ship had taken damage to the maneuvering thrusters and was slow to respond, and the human vessels fired at the same instant, and their rounds struck the shield generators in sequence, and the shields collapsed. Ember screeched in alarm, and Storm launched himself toward the viewport as though he could physically block the next attack, and Lysara felt fear for the first time in decades because her ship was vulnerable and the humans had the clear shot. But the next volley did not come, and instead Amy Wilson's voice filled the bridge again, and the human captain said she did not want to kill anyone, and suggested they talk before more people died for no good reason. Lysara's tactical officer argued that this was a trick and they should keep fighting, but she looked at her display and saw that 6 of her ships were disabled, and human vessels were positioned to cripple the rest, and they could have pressed the attack, but had chosen to offer negotiation. She had led hundreds of battles and conquered countless worlds, and she understood warfare better than most living beings, and she recognized when an enemy held the advantage but showed restraint, and that kind of behavior from a species defending their homes suggested something important. The War Council would call this weakness and demand she continue fighting, but the Council was not here watching human Marines throw themselves in front of plasma fire to save their comrades and listening to them sing while facing death and seeing them offer mercy from positions of strength. Lysara gave the order to cease fire, and her officers protested until she explained that humans had already proven they could destroy the fleet but were trying to minimize casualties, and that level of discipline while under attack meant they were far more dangerous than intelligence reports suggested. She opened a channel to Amy Wilson and said the Valkoran would agree to temporary peace while they discussed terms, and the human captain responded immediately and suggested they meet on neutral ground with minimal guards. The meeting took place on a small station that orbited between the 2 fleets, and Lysara brought only Cathara as escort, while Ember and Storm flanked her, because she would not go anywhere without her dragons. Amy Wilson arrived with 2 human soldiers who looked alert, but not aggressive, and the captain walked forward with confidence that came from knowing her fleet was ready to resume fighting if negotiations failed. Lysara had expected the humans to show fear when they saw Storm, because the great dragon was twice the size of any human, and his teeth could tear through steel. But Amy looked at him with curiosity instead of terror. The human captain asked if she could approach the dragons, and Lysara was so surprised by the request that she granted permission without thinking, and Amy walked slowly toward Storm while speaking in a soft voice. Storm lowered his massive head and allowed this strange creature to touch his scales, and Ember immediately jumped down from Lysera's shoulder and wrapped around Amy's legs like she had found something interesting. No other species had ever gained her dragon's trust so quickly, and Lysera watched as Amy scratched under Ember's chin, and the small dragon made happy sounds, and Storm closed his eyes in contentment while the human stroked his nose. Amy explained that humans had their own history with animals and had learned to work with creatures instead of just commanding them. And they understood that trust was earned, not demanded. Lysera asked why the dragons responded to her, and Amy said that animals could sense intentions and her people meant no harm to creatures that had not harmed them, and they respected strength, but also recognized that strength came in many forms. The negotiations began, and Lysera expected standard terms about tribute and submission, but Amy surprised her by saying that humans would never accept Valkoran rule and would fight until either side was destroyed if necessary. She explained that humans had survived on a harsh world that tried to kill them in countless ways, and they had learned that giving up meant death and fighting meant a chance at survival. And that lesson was burned into their nature. Lysera pointed out that the Valkoran had superior technology and more experience and greater numbers, and could simply return with enough force to overwhelm any human defense. Amy agreed that was true, and said that humans would lose that fight, but would make victory so expensive that the Valkoran would regret starting the war, and they would use every dirty trick and guerrilla tactic and suicide attack until the cost became unbearable. The human captain opened a data file and showed casualty projections that human strategists had calculated, and the numbers suggested that conquering human space would require decades of fighting and cost millions of Valkoran lives. Lysera studied the projections and realized they were probably accurate, because humans had already demonstrated tactical creativity that matched their desperation, and a species that sang while fighting and offered mercy to enemies was capable of anything. Lysera looked at the casualty numbers again and felt something cold settle in her chest, because she had led enough campaigns to know when projections were realistic, and the humans had done their homework and understood exactly what a prolonged war would cost both sides. Amy Wilson waited patiently while Ember climbed up her arm and perched on her shoulder, and the small dragon seemed completely comfortable with this stranger, and Storm made a low, rumbling sound that indicated approval. The human captain said her people did not want war but would not accept slavery, and they were willing to die for that principle because freedom was worth any price, and history had taught them that those who gave up liberty for safety ended up with neither. Lysera asked what humans wanted if not peace through submission, and Amy said they wanted to be left alone to build their civilization and explore space and maybe trade with species that respected their independence. The Valkoran commander pointed out that the Empire did not make exceptions, and allowing humans to remain free would encourage other species to rebel, and the entire structure of galactic order would collapse if prey species stopped accepting their place. Amy smiled at that and said maybe the galactic order needed to collapse if it was built on conquest and slavery, and perhaps there were better ways to organize civilizations that did not require some species to dominate all the others. Lysera had never heard anyone question the fundamental structure of the galaxy before, and the idea made her uncomfortable because she had spent 3 centuries enforcing that structure and believing it was natural and inevitable. She asked what would happen if the Valkoran withdrew from human space, and Amy said the humans would remember who showed them respect and would be willing to help defend Valkoran interests against common threats. The offer made no sense tactically because species that were spared conquest usually just strengthened themselves and became bigger problems later. But Amy explained that humans understood gratitude and loyalty, and they repaid debts to those who treated them fairly. Lysera said she would need to consult with the War Council, and Amy agreed to extend the ceasefire while negotiations continued, and both fleets would maintain their positions, but not engage unless attacked. The return journey to Valkoran space took 3 weeks, and Lysera spent the time reviewing battle recordings and analyzing human tactics, and the more she studied them, the more impressed she became with their adaptability. The War Council met in the Great Hall where decisions about the Empire had been made for 5,000 years, and the elders sat on thrones carved from single pieces of crystal, and their faces showed the arrogance that came from never being challenged. Lysera presented her report, and explained that humans were unlike any species the Valkoran had encountered because they combined weakness in individual combat with strength in collective action, and they would never stop fighting no matter how many died. The eldest council member said that every species claimed they would fight forever, but all of them, eventually, broke when faced with overwhelming force, and humans would be no different once they saw their worlds burning. She played the battle recordings and showed how human soldiers sacrificed themselves to save comrades, and how they sang while facing death, and how they offered mercy when they held the advantage. The council watched in silence, and Lysera could see them struggling to understand behavior that did not fit their models of how prey species acted when confronted by predators. Another elder argued that the projections about casualties were exaggerated to make humans seem more dangerous than they really were, and that one more campaign with sufficient forces would end the resistance. Lysera had expected this response, and she presented intelligence about human colony worlds and showed how they were already building defensive networks and training civilian populations for guerrilla warfare and preparing for a conflict that might last generations. She explained that humans had a concept they called total war, where entire populations dedicated themselves to military efforts, and they would turn every world into a fortress and every citizen into a soldier if they believed their freedom was threatened. The council chamber erupted in debate, and some members argued for immediate escalation, while others suggested that maybe one exception to imperial policy would not destroy the galactic order. Lysera waited for the arguing to quiet and then said something that she had never thought she would say, which was that perhaps the Valkoran had become so focused on conquest that they had forgotten to ask whether conquest was always the best solution. The eldest council member looked at her with ancient eyes and asked if she was suggesting the Empire should show weakness, and she replied that there was a difference between weakness and wisdom. She pointed out that the Valkyran had spent millennia building an empire through force, but had never built anything through cooperation, and maybe humans were offering an opportunity to try something different. The debate continued for days, and Lysera returned to her quarters where Ember and Storm waited, and she sat with her dragons and wondered if she had made the right choice by advocating for peace. Cathera came to visit, and the warriors said that many of the soldiers were talking about the humans and how they fought with honor even when outmatched, and some were questioning whether conquest was really the only way. Lysera asked what Cathera thought, and the warrior said she had spent her life fighting but had never seen an enemy offer mercy from a position of strength, and that kind of restraint suggested the humans might be worth knowing as something other than subjects. The War Council finally reached a decision and summoned Lysera back to the Great Hall, and the eldest member announced that the Valkoran would agree to a treaty with humans that recognized their independence in exchange for non-aggression and mutual defense agreements. The decision shocked the Empire because the Valkoran had never made such an agreement before, and other species watched carefully to see if this meant the age of conquest was ending. Lysera returned to Haven 7 with the treaty terms, and Amy Wilson met her at the same neutral station, and this time both of them came alone, except for the dragons. The human captain read the treaty and asked if the council had really agreed to all these terms, and Lysera confirmed that they had, and explained that humans had taught the Valkyran something new about strength. Amy signed the treaty, and said she hoped this was the beginning of something good for both species, and Lysera found herself agreeing, even though she was not sure what good meant in this context. The weeks that followed were strange as both fleets withdrew and returned to their respective territories, and Lysera expected to feel relieved but instead felt oddly disappointed that the conflict had ended without a clear victor. She was reassigned to patrol duties along the new border between Valkoran and human space, and her orders were to monitor for threats and assist human vessels if they requested help. The first time she encountered a human ship on patrol, it was Amy Wilson's vessel, and the captain hailed her and suggested they coordinate their routes to cover more territory efficiently. Lysera agreed and found that working with humans was easier than expected because they were professional and kept their word and showed the same respect they demanded from others. Storm and Ember seemed to enjoy the interactions, and whenever human ships came near, the dragons would become excited and watch the viewports as though hoping to see their new friends. Amy invited Lysera to visit Haven 7 during off-duty time, and she accepted more out of curiosity than friendship, and found herself walking through human streets where people stared at her silver hair and violet eyes but showed more interest than fear. The human captain showed her how the colony worked and explained that humans built their societies around cooperation and individual choice, and people contributed because they wanted to, not because they were forced. Lysara saw human children playing with dogs and cats and asked about the animals, and Amy explained that humans had domesticated other species on their homeworld and learned to build partnerships with creatures that were different from them. The visits became regular, and Lysara found herself looking forward to conversations with Amy about topics that had nothing to do with military matters, and she learned about human art and music and philosophy. The friendship between Lysara and Amy grew slowly, like ice melting in spring, and at first they only discussed patrol schedules and border security. But gradually their conversations expanded to include personal topics and shared experiences. Amy told stories about growing up on Earth and how she had always dreamed of exploring space and joining the defense forces to protect human colonies, and Lysara listened and realized that humans carried hopes and fears that were not so different from her own people. She shared memories of her youth on the Valkoran homeworld, and how she had bonded with Ember and Storm when they were hatchlings, and the human captain asked questions that showed genuine interest in dragon care and Valkoran culture. The dragons had fully accepted Amy by now, and Storm would rumble happily when her ship appeared on sensors, and Ember had started bringing her small gifts like shiny rocks or interesting pieces of metal she found on patrol. Other Valkoran warriors noticed the friendship and some disapproved because they believed commanders should maintain distance from other species. But others were curious about humans and started their own conversations with human crews. Cathara became friends with a human marine named Lisa Chen, who had been part of the boarding teams that fought against dragon riders, and the two warriors traded combat techniques and training methods and discovered they had similar philosophies about honor in battle. The border region became a unique place where two species that should have been enemies learned to work together and trust each other. And the cooperation produced results that surprised both governments. A pirate fleet attacked a human convoy and Lysara's patrol responded immediately, and her dragons helped drive off the raiders, and the human crew sent messages of gratitude and offered to share supplies. When a Valkoran science vessel had engine trouble in deep space, a human repair ship came to assist, and their engineers worked alongside Valkoran technicians and fixed the problem in half the expected time. The War Council received reports about these incidents and called Lysara back to explain why she was becoming so close to humans, and whether she had forgotten her duty to the Empire. She stood before the Council and said that her duty was to protect Valkoran interests, and the treaty with humans was serving those interests better than conquest would have, and cooperation was producing benefits that war never could. The eldest council member asked if she believed humans could truly be trusted, and Lysara replied that trust was built through actions, not assumptions, and humans had proven themselves reliable partners. Another elder pointed out that other species were watching the human treaty, and some were requesting similar agreements, and the Empire was losing the fear that kept subject worlds obedient. Lysara responded that fear was useful for controlling enemies but useless for building alliances, and maybe the Valkoran needed allies more than they needed slaves. The council dismissed her, and she returned to her patrol duties, wondering if she had damaged her career by speaking so directly, but Amy told her that doing the right thing often had costs. Months passed and the cooperation continued, and human and Valkoran forces started conducting joint training exercises to prepare for common threats, and the exercises revealed how much each species could learn from the other. Humans showed Valkoran warriors how to use terrain and technology to compensate for physical disadvantages, and the Valkoran taught humans about the bond between rider and mount, and how to work with creatures that had their own intelligent. Storm and Ember participated in the training, and human soldiers learned to respect dragons not as weapons, but as beings with personalities and preferences. And the dragons responded by accepting humans as part of their extended pack. A crisis emerged when a hostile species called the Kresh launched raids into both Valkoran and human territory, and intelligence suggested they were testing defenses before a larger invasion. The Kresh were insectoid creatures that fought in massive swarms and used biological weapons, and they had been slowly expanding through a neighboring sector and consuming everything in their path. Amy contacted Lysara and suggested they coordinate their response and combine their forces to hit the Kresh staging areas before they could launch the main attack. The proposal was unprecedented because Valkoran and human forces had never fought together in offensive operations, and it would require complete trust and seamless coordination. Lysara brought the plan to the War Council and argued that this was an opportunity to demonstrate the value of the human alliance and show other species what cooperation could accomplish. The council debated for days, but finally agreed to allow a joint operation with strict conditions about command structure and rules of engagement. The combined fleet assembled at a neutral point, and Lysara met with Amy and other human commanders to plan the attack, and they studied Kresh tactics and identified weaknesses. Human strategists suggested using their small fast ships to draw out Kresh swarms, while Valkoran dragons attacked from unexpected angles, and the plan used each species' strengths to cover the other's weaknesses. The attack began at dawn on a Kresh colony world, and human vessels swept in low over the surface while broadcasting signals that attracted the insectoid defenders. Thousands of Kresh warriors emerged and pursued the human ships into a valley where Valkoran forces were waiting, and Storm led dozens of dragons in a dive that caught the swarm from above. The dragons breathed fire that incinerated the Kresh, while human ships wheeled around and fired into the confused mass, and within minutes the swarm was broken and retreating. The ground assault involved Valkoran warriors and human marines working side by side, and Cathera fought next to Lisa Chen, and they moved like partners who had trained together for years. The Kresh tried to regroup, but the combined force pressed the advantage and destroyed their command structure and supply depots, and by nightfall, the colony was abandoned. Similar strikes hit other Kresh positions, and the coordinated attacks shattered their invasion plans and forced them to withdraw from both Valkoran and human space. The victory celebrations happened on Haven 7, and the station was crowded with warriors from both species, sharing stories and drinks and laughter. Lysara watched Ember playing with human children who were not afraid of the dragon, and Storm accepted scratches from off-duty Marines, and she realized that something fundamental had changed. Amy found her on an observation deck, looking out at the stars, and said that they had proven cooperation could defeat threats that might have overwhelmed either species alone. Lysara agreed and said she had spent centuries believing the Valkoran way was the only way. But humans had shown her that strength came in many forms, and the strongest forces were built on trust, not fear. The human captain asked what would happen next and whether the alliance would last or fade once the immediate threat passed. Lysara said she could not predict the future, but she knew that warriors who had fought together and saved each other's lives would not easily become enemies again. The weeks after the battle brought changes as other species approached both the Valkyran and humans, asking about treaties and alliances, and the Galactic Order began shifting in ways no one had anticipated. War Council called Lysara back again. And this time the meeting was different because the elders had received reports from dozens of worlds about the joint victory and the efficiency of cooperation. The eldest member said the council had decided to establish a formal alliance with humanity and create a joint command structure for mutual defense, and they wanted Lysara to lead the Valkoran side. She accepted the position and returned to Haven 7, where Amy had received a similar promotion, to lead human forces in the alliance. They stood together on the bridge of a new station built specifically for the joint command, and watched as ships from both species patrolled together and worked as one force. Amy said they had started something that would change the galaxy, and Lysara replied that they had simply shown that the old ways were not the only ways. Storm and Ember rested nearby, and the dragons seemed content with the new arrangement, and Lysara thought about how strange it was that two species that should have destroyed each other had instead built something better together. The joint command station grew over the following years as more resources were dedicated to the alliance, and what started as a temporary cooperation became the foundation for something larger and more permanent. Lysara spent her days coordinating patrols and training exercises and diplomatic missions with Amy, and they developed a working relationship that went beyond simple military cooperation into genuine partnership. The changes spread through both civilizations as warriors who served Together returned home with stories about their former enemies, and young Valkoran started questioning the old teachings about conquest and dominance. Human colonies welcomed Valkoran visitors, and trade began flowing between the species and cultural exchanges happened as artists and scientists and philosophers shared ideas that had developed independently for millennia. Ember had grown larger and now matched Storm in size, and both dragons had become symbols of the alliance because they moved freely between human and Valkoran ships and accepted crew members from both species. Amy introduced Lysara to human food and entertainment, and she discovered that humans created art that expressed emotions in ways Valkoran culture had never explored, and their music could make her feel things she had no words for. She taught Amy about dragon care and Valkoran meditation techniques and the ancient stories her people told about the first warriors who bonded with dragons and learned to fly between stars. The friendship deepened as they faced challenges together and made decisions that affected billions of lives and learned to trust each other's judgment even when they disagreed about methods. Other species watched the alliance with mixed feelings, because some saw opportunity for similar partnerships while others feared that the balance of power was shifting in dangerous ways. A coalition of older civilizations demanded that the Valkoran return to traditional empire building and stop encouraging rebellion through their example, and they threatened economic sanctions if the alliance continued. The War Council divided over the issue, with some elders wanting to maintain the alliance, while others argued that the Valkoran were losing their identity and becoming too much like humans. Lysara was called to testify, and she stood before the council and said that the Valkoran had not lost their identity, but had discovered parts of themselves they never knew existed. She explained that her warriors fought better now because they understood what they were protecting, instead of just following orders, and they showed more courage because they chose their battles, instead of having battles chosen for them. The eldest council member asked if she believed the alliance was worth risking everything the Valkyran had built over thousands of years, and she said yes without hesitation. Amy came to the Valkyran homeworld to support Lysara, and it was the first time a human had set foot on the planet, and crowds gathered to see the strange creature who had changed their civilization. The human captain spoke to the council and said that her people had learned from the Valkoran about discipline and honor, and long-term planning, and the alliance had made both species stronger. She pointed out that the galaxy was changing whether anyone wanted it to or not, and the choice was between adapting together or falling separately. The council debated for weeks while Lysara and Amy waited, and during that time they explored the Valkoran homeworld, and Lysara showed her friend the crystal forests where dragons were born, and the ancient cities carved into mountainsides. Amy was amazed by the beauty and said she finally understood why the Valkoran were so proud and why they had believed themselves superior to other species for so long. Lysara replied that pride was not the same as superiority, and the Valkoran were learning to be proud of what they could become, rather than what they had always been. The council finally announced their decision, and they chose to maintain the alliance and invite other species to join if they agreed to the principles of mutual respect and cooperative defense. The announcement sent waves through the galaxy, as civilizations reconsidered their relationships, and some former enemies approached each other about ending conflicts and building partnerships. A federation began forming with the Valkoran-Human Alliance at its core, and dozens of species contributed ships and resources and knowledge to the collective defense. The Kresh launched another invasion, but this time they faced a united front that included tactics and technologies from 20 different civilizations, and the attackers were driven back. Decisively, Lysara and Amy found themselves leading forces that represented the diversity of the galaxy, and they worked to ensure that all members of the Federation were treated as equals. Storm and Ember became ambassadors in their own right as they visited different worlds and showed species that had never seen dragons before that these magnificent creatures could be gentle as well as fierce. Years passed, and the alliance transformed into something that resembled a true government, with representatives from member species making decisions collectively about trade and security and exploration. Lysara received an offer to join the Federation Council as the Valkoran representative, and Amy was offered a similar position for humanity, and they accepted, knowing it meant leaving active military service. The transition was difficult because both of them were warriors at heart, but they understood that building peace required different skills than winning wars. They established offices next to each other in the Federation capital and continued working together on problems that affected multiple species. Kethera took over military command, and she promoted Lisa Chen to be her deputy, and the two warriors maintained the training programs that had made cooperation between species possible. Ember and Storm retired from active duty and spent their time on a preserved world where dragons from different Valkoran families could live together, and they seemed content to rest after decades of service. Lysara visited them regularly and brought Amy along, and they would sit with the dragons and watch the stars and talk about everything they had seen and done. Amy said she never imagined when she first saw the Valkoran fleet that they would end up as friends and partners in building a new kind of civilization. Lysara admitted she had expected to conquer Haven 7 in a few days and return home victorious, and instead she had learned that victory could mean something other than dominance. They discussed what would happen when they were gone because both of them were aging, even though Valkyran lived much longer than humans, and eventually new leaders would take their places. Amy said she hoped the next generation would remember that cooperation was a choice that had to be made every day, and that peace required as much courage as war. Lysara agreed and added that the greatest strength was knowing when to fight and when to build, and having the wisdom to tell the difference. The Federation continued growing and faced new challenges as it expanded into unexplored regions and encountered species that had never heard of cooperation between different civilizations. Some conflicts were resolved peacefully while others required military intervention. But the Federation approach was always to seek understanding first and use force only as a last resort. Lysara and Amy worked together for another 20 years before Amy retired due to age, and Lysara continued for several decades more before finally stepping down. They both received honors from the Federation, and their names were recorded in the histories of multiple species as the founders of the Great Alliance. Storm and Ember lived for another century, and their descendants spread across Federation space and bonded with riders from species other than Valkoran. The galaxy that Lysara had known in her youth was gone, and in its place was something stranger and more hopeful, where former predators and prey worked together and strength was measured by cooperation rather than conquest. She spent her final years on the preserve world with Storm and Ember, and sometimes Amy's descendants came to visit and brought stories about how the Federation had grown. Storm died first and Ember followed soon after, and Lysara felt their loss like physical pain, but also gratitude for the centuries they had shared. She lived long enough to see the Federation include more than 100 species, and to know that the work she and Amy had started would continue long after both of them were forgotten. The last time she looked at the stars, she thought about that first meeting with Amy Wilson, and how a battle that should have ended in conquest instead became the beginning of friendship. The galaxy still held dangers and conflicts, but it also held possibilities that had not existed before, and species that had once feared each other now built futures together. Lysara closed her eyes, knowing that humans had indeed been the match for the Valkyran, but not in the way anyone expected, because they had matched them not in violence but in vision.